I'm George Galloway, and I present Kali Mahorra on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kali Mahorra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kali Mahorra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kali Mahorra. With me, George Galloway, for Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, discussing the topic of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a thing. It's a big thing in British politics right now in 2019. It's a big thing in American politics, where its shadow is beginning to influence political events in the run-up to the selection of the Democratic Party's candidate for president and presumably for the presidency itself. Ironically, for deployment, if a Jewish man, Senator Bernie Sanders, becomes the US Democratic presidential candidate. An irony indeed, because the attack will be, already is, on Bernie Sanders, that he's an anti-Semite. Now, it's not unusual these days for Jewish people to be accused of anti-Semitism. As a matter of fact, there are people in this room who have been falsely accused of exactly that. You may think that ontologically it's rather a perverse accusation, like saying a black man is anti-black. But it is deployed here in Britain in attacks on supporters of the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, who happen to be Jewish. Indeed, in one case, both black and Jewish, and currently suspended from the Labour Party. I refer to the activist Jackie Walker. So it's already begun in the United States. It's raging here. So one of our purposes today is to define what anti-Semitism actually is. Because if we have no agreed definition, we'll not be able to judge whether accusations of it are fair and just or otherwise. Anti-Semitism is historically a very big thing. Jews have been on the receiving end of the lash of bigotry and hatred and prejudice and pogrom and murder, and in the 20th century, mass murder on an industrial scale. 6 million Jews were massacred systematically, industrially, annihilated by European fascism. Not by Germans alone, though the fascist state in Germany takes responsibility for it, but fascists of all kinds, French fascists, Dutch fascists, Ukrainian fascists, Lithuanian fascists. Fascists everywhere could hardly wait for the SS to arrive before they set upon their own Jewish neighbors and compatriots, in many cases packing them onto the trains to their death in the death camps run by the fascist regime in Germany. But of course, that's the most extreme end of it. Pogrom after pogrom, bigotry upon bigotry, discrimination and hatred for centuries, perhaps millennia. So not only is anti-Semitism a thing, it is a thing which fueled, arguably, I do argue it, some dispute it, the greatest crime in human history, the systematic attempt to eliminate from the earth every last Jew, which was embarked upon in the 1930s and 40s in Europe. On that, most people would agree. The dictionary definition of anti-Semitism is clear. hatred towards Jews and its manifestations in discrimination, bigotry, and so on. That's anti-Semitism. Although, as some learned sages have pointed out, that is what it used to be. Now, it's the definition of someone that the majority trend amongst the Jewish community don't like. If I give you this example, when I was in Parliament for nearly 30 years, when Ken Livingston was in Parliament over much the same period, and when he was Mayor of London, the idea that there was anti-Semitism in the British Labour Party was simply outlandish. Many of our closest comrades were Jewish. Labour had a disproportionately large number of Jewish members of Parliament. Labour had, just before Corbyn, a Jewish leader. Indeed, the leadership campaign was fought between two Jewish brothers, David Miliband and Ed Miliband, both of them sons of one of the great luminaries of socialism in this country, the late and great Professor Ralph Miliband. The idea that a party that had an election for leader between two Jewish brothers was somehow a sink of anti-Semitism might be thought by many to be absurd and definitely worthy of suspicion, because it is no coincidence that the allegation that the Labour Party is a sink of anti-Semitism, in fact, institutionally anti-Semitic, began when? On the day and hour that Jeremy Corbyn began to look like he would become the leader of the Labour Party. Now, what did they have against Jeremy Corbyn, the people who now accuse him? Well, nothing actually, until he began to look like the next leader of the Labour Party. Nothing at all. You could do a data search. Jeremy Corbyn, a member of Parliament for well over 30 years now, and in public life for more than 40, had never been accused of anti-Semitism before. Do the search yourselves. So, if what they have against him isn't that he is actually anti-Semitic, what else could it be? And the more discerning amongst you will already have worked that out. They attack Jeremy Corbyn very belatedly in his long life as an anti-Semite because he is A, pro-Palestinian, and B, stands a good chance of being Britain's next Prime Minister. And that has very great political implications. What do they have against Bernie Sanders? Well, just that he might become the first Jewish president of the United States, but he's quite sympathetic, actually, to the Palestinians and quite hostile to Mr. Netanyahu and his government. And so, I'm here to say that whilst anti-Semitism could not be a more foul and poisonous and deadly strain of racism, false accusations of it in order to defend the racist apartheid state of Israel is a crime itself, and one which we should not tolerate. Now, we have an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs. We'll soon find out who has what to say. I'm going to recognize first a man I have known, sorry Tony, for almost 40 years, who is Jewish, who has been expelled from the Labour Party, not in the end for anti-Semitism, That was even a bridge too far for today's witch hunters, but originally accused of anti-Semitism. He's the son of a rabbi. His name is Tony Greenstein. An unlikely anti-Semite, you might think. But Tony, you know how the charge of anti-Semitism is being weaponized in British politics, and I'm sure you're aware of how it's already being weaponized in the United States. The floor is yours.
Well, yes, indeed. If you want to blackmail and intimidate people, there is no better charge, precisely because of the history of the Holocaust, to accuse someone of being anti-Semitic. But anti-Semitism has a very simple definition: hostility to or prejudice against Jews. But that is not really very good, because the purpose of the anti-Semitism charge is to protect the state of Israel. And therefore they've come up with a 500-word definition which conflates anti-Zionism, opposition to the racial ideology that set up Israel, with hostility to Jewish people. And they've conflated and mixed it up together. But we should be quite clear: if you oppose anti-Semitism, then you oppose all forms of racism. It's a principle. And we know that Netanyahu made it clear that Israel is not a state of its own citizens. It's a state only of its Jewish citizens. And that kind of state has not existed since the 1930s in Europe. So I think we should be quite clear. We should also be clear that historically, the main opposition to Zionism came from Jewish people themselves, for a very simple reason. Zionism says Jews do not belong in a diaspora. Their home, if you like, is in Israel. And that's exactly what the anti-Semites say. So if someone comes up to me in a bar and says, you don't belong in this country, they're either a Zionist or they're an anti-Semite, and sometimes both, in fact.
Ken Livingston, you were the mayor of London twice, the first and finest, and then re-elected. Anti-Semitism in London went down considerably under your watch, and then under your successor it doubled. How do you view the current controversies over this issue?
Well, when I became mayor, one of the first things I did was meet with the Board of Deputies of British Jews. We didn't agree about Israel's policy towards the Palestinians, but we agreed to put on Jewish events so that non-Jews could come and see Jewish culture. We did the same with Muslims and Hindus. I took the view that your job as mayor is to promote tolerance and understanding between the different communities in your city. Of course, then Boris took over. All he did was promote himself, and then anti-Semitic incidents doubled. But the simple fact is, anyone who criticises the Israeli government's policy towards the Palestinians is denounced as anti-Semitic. And what worries me most about that is the increasing obsession about this in the media, I think fuels genuine anti-Semitic incidents and attacks. People who are anti-Semitic, seeing all this in the media, are much more likely to go out and attack someone who's Jewish, smear something on the wall, a Jewish organisation and so on, or a synagogue. And so I would simply say, don't abuse this. We need to tackle every form of racism. And I remember there was an opinion poll done when I was mayor, which showed 9% of people in Britain have some degree of anti-Semitic views, but 45% of people living in France. And I think there is still a problem with racism of many kinds in Britain, but we've come a lot farther than almost any other country in challenging and tackling that and reducing it. So I just simply say, I suspect the most significant thing is the people that don't want Jeremy in Downing Street, it's not because they fear he's anti-Semitic. They fear he's going to crack down on all the tax dodgers. He's going to make corporations pay their fair share of tax. And that's what they fear. And they'll use any smear to keep him out of office. They want to be able to carry on diverting their funds to all sorts of dodgy offshore tax havens and so on. That's the core of it. That's why they don't want Jeremy in office.
Adam Garrie, you are a historian. An increasingly influential one. There is a history, a long history of anti-Semitism in Britain. There have been pogroms in Britain. in the 1930s, there was widespread anti-Semitism in Britain. And even after the Second World War and the exposure of the Holocaust and so on, there were still anti-Semites running around, standing for office, and so on. The British ruling class, the British anti-Semites, never got the chance that those in occupied Europe did to practice their anti-Semitism against British Jews, but they might well have, if they'd had the chance, mightn't they?
Well, it could have all been very different if someone like Oswald Mosley, who in the 1930s, his Union of British Fascists, it did what it said on the tin, was growing and growing. And the biggest opposition to the growth of the fascist movement was from the Labour movement and from those on the left. And one doesn't need to be part of the right or the left or anywhere in between in the 21st century to recognize that this is an historic fact. Part of the very fibre and DNA of the modern Labour movement is its physical and political and ideological, dare I say metaphysical, opposition to this fascism. And that is one of the reasons, one of many, but certainly in terms of party politics, a very important reason why British parliamentary institutions remain strong at a time when almost every other country in Europe, literally almost every other, and not just the ones immediately controlled by Hitler, went to the far right, went to the side of fascism, and in every case this included a strong element of vehement anti-Semitism.
Even in countries where there were no Jews, anti-Semitism without Jews is a known phenomenon. And I experienced it myself in Romania, for example. After the fall of Ceausescu, I had many long hours with the chief rabbi in Romania. And we talked about the virulent anti-Semitism in Romania, even though there were, by then, virtually no Romanian Jews. Either they had been massacred in the Holocaust or they had long emigrated to Israel. Indeed, Ceausescu brokered their emigration to Israel. Why are people anti-Semitic? What's the origin of these tropes, as they're now called, conflating bankers with Jews? And so if you don't like bankers, ipso facto, you don't like Jews. What's the origin of these tropes historically?
In Europe, the historical origin of this dates back to a concept known as the court Jew, and it further goes back to the concept where, because the majority either Roman Catholic or later Protestant populations of Central, Northern and Western Europe weren't allowed to engage in certain financial professions, the Jewish diaspora of Europe didn't have these prohibitions because they didn't take communion. They weren't baptized as Christians. So that's the specific origin of why Jews in Europe and elsewhere are accused of doing certain vicious things, which are, of course, a heinous stereotype. But more importantly, while every form of bigotry has a different origin, while every stereotype is authored based on a different conception or misconception of a prior reality, all forms of hatred against any minority group have the same general and broad root, and that is economic inequality. Of course, even in a society where everyone is well off, there'll always be bigotry, there'll always be prejudice, but the worse the life gets in terms of living standards for the ordinary person, the more they look for the scapegoat. And in fact, one of the men who is incidentally from another minority, he's a Chinese American, an Asian American, as many say in the United States, called Andrew Yang. He's a very interesting man running for president, and he said that he fears that with this hysteria of a new Cold War against China, and with living standards of working class, mainly white, mainly non-Asian, mainly non-Jewish Americans going down, people will look to Asians just as first they look to the Jews, then after September 11th in particular, they look to the Muslims, and then Chinese Americans, and frankly, all Asian Americans will be next. So there's this slippery slope where various groups get singled out because of various rumors, innuendo, and outright pathetic lies. And economic inequality among the majoritarian population is almost always the root of a surge in hatred against a minority.
And it is, as you say, a movable feast. If you read one of the great books of my own youth, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropist by Robert Tressel. He talks, I think around 1904, talks about the media hysteria about Jewish immigrants coming here, fleeing from the pogroms of Russia and other parts of East and Central Europe, and the language in which the popular press and politicians, with an impact on the population, of course, his fellow workers, is exactly the same kind of language and demonization, subhumanization that was later used, is now used against black people and Muslim people, black Muslims in particular.
Yes, these things are indeed very flexible, because I think one of the things that we've totally lost touch with in terms of the contemporary media debates about hatred of minority groups is that it's not as though the people who decide to hate someone else think of this scientifically. If their minds were so complex and so programmed to think algorithmically, they'd most likely find something better to do with their lives other than live for one purpose only, to hate someone else. They'd be enriching their lives. They'd invent something. So it's not as though there's an equation of algebra that determines what makes someone hate someone else. The stereotypes exist. They're on the shelf. They can be rearranged and new ingredients can be added over time. But these are age-old, and certain developments in an economy, in a society, can agitate a certain group of people within the majority population to foment these hatreds right off the shelf against people. And that's why, in my view, it's the first duty of the political class to make sure that those conditions which lead to these hatreds, which will never fully go away, being taken off the shelf, it is their duty to slam that lid shut by carefully managing society.
Ken?
Can I say, I think that's absolutely right. Back in 1906, the Daily Mail headline was "Jews bring crime and disease to Britain." And I grew up like you did after the Second World War. We were told, don't touch black people, they're dirty. But now it's the Muslims. And a poll out in the last week or so showed that something like a third of Conservative voters believe there are parts of Britain where Sharia law is imposed. Now, this is just nonsense. But it's Islamophobia in the papers, and the papers and the media and the internet, of course, are now major players in creating, as they've always been, racism.
Much more of this after the break. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, talking about anti-Semitism. Earlier, we took the Kalimahora camera onto the streets of London to hear what the people thought. Let's take a look.
What do you think anti-Semitism is?
Disrespecting each other's religious beliefs.
Someone's hate toward Jewish people and their religion and their beliefs.
Well, my understanding of it, it's either direct discrimination or racism against Jewish people, I think.
I think anti-Semitism, especially in the modern day sort of world we live in, is anti-Jewish, basically.
Well, anti-Semitism, I think, as a whole, it does define the racism towards Jews.
Well, how it's used is as a term describing racism against Jews, but as I understand it, Palestinians are also Semites.
Would you say that anti-Zionism is the same as anti-Semitism, or is it different?
My feeling is that anti-Zionism is not the same. I find Israel to be very problematic, and I find the defense of Israel's policies against the Palestinians to be criminal, in fact. And I think it's high time that the two, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, were clearly demonstrated and held as being different instead of conflated for the purposes of certain people and certain agendas.
Well, it all depends on who you define as the natural birthright to Zion. You know, Eastern Europeans have made their home in Israel. No one has it's just like how blacks have made their home here. You can't really, you know, there has to be a bit of give and take.
I think they are two different things, because I think you can criticize Israel government apart from their religious belief.
You can criticize the state of Israel and how they do things, treat Palestinians and so on. But that doesn't make you anti-Semitic, because criticism of a state isn't the same as criticism of a religion.
We're from Ireland, and religion and state have always been very together. I do not think religion and state go with each other. My thoughts are not my political thoughts. My faith is not my politics. My faith is what I believe in, and that's it. And it's not your politics, it's not your politics.
Faith in general should not just be involved with politics at all.
Yeah. But everything is political these days, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
The lady in the hat put her finger on it, didn't she? It's conflation. It's conflation of two different things into one thing. And for the most part, for a deliberate reason. Because, as Tony Greenstein said earlier, who could be respectable in politics if they hated Jews? But if you hate Israel, hate Netanyahu, hate the occupation, it's a bit harder to attack you on that, because Israel has never been more unpopular in the world. So why not conflate the two and kill two birds with one stone? Tony, why has it been so successful then? You can't argue that it hasn't been successful. For a start, you're sitting outside the Labour Party instead of in it, as you were for many decades.
Oh, well, I think it was successful, or has been successful, because of necessity. When Corbyn was seen as likely to come to power, I have no doubt that the centres of power, whether it's in the United States or in Britain or in Israel, took fright. Anti-NATO, anti-nuclear, anti-war. Of course they had to wage a campaign, and the Daily Mail was the first when it said that Corbyn was associated with Holocaust deniers, and it ran from there. And not just in the Mail, but in The Guardian was one of the worst offenders, Jonathan Friedland in particular. So it's a kind of consensus, it's a narrative which actually doesn't accord with everyday reality. If you go into the Labour Party, I mean, you know, I've never had anyone make an anti-Semitic comment, but I joked to people the other day, if what they say is true about this anti-Semitism, then every time I come out of my house, I should look left, I should look right, and left again, because surely someone is about to attack me. But that isn't the everyday experience at all. The reality is, I mean, you mentioned 1906. The people today who are so hot on anti-Semitism, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, in 1906, they barely opposed the Aliens Act against the Jewish refugees from Tsarist Russia. And in the 1930s, when Mosley was stomping through the East End and they had the Battle of Cable Street in 1936, the Board of Deputies said, keep your heads down, stay indoors, don't fight them. And the majority of Jews disregarded them. 100,000 more people went onto the streets of the East End and stopped Mosley in his tracks.
And the Daily Mail you mentioned was supporting Mosley.
Hurrah for the black shirts, of course.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I mean, just very fascinating historical background. Just in terms of the accusation of anti-Semitism, as I have seen it in my lifetime, it has primarily been used as a way to censor or suppress pro-Palestinian views. And the two examples that I can think of, actually one dates back to your election campaign against Una King back in 2005 or something. Because you had pro-Palestinian views, Una King brought up the issue of Judaism, even though I think nobody even knew what her religion was at that time. So that was used during that campaign. And another incident I can think of was when, I think she was a former Israeli agricultural minister, Aloni. Yes, that's it.
Yeah. I knew her well. What you're about to say,
yes,
she said to me personally over dinner
so you know.
in her house in Israel. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, she just said that, it's a tactic that pro-Israeli Jews use to silence any criticism. Like if it's a German person talking about Palestinian rights, they'll bring up Hitler, or if it's somebody else, they'll just, they'll bring up anti-Semitism as a way just to shut down the conversation and just leave it there. It's just a political tactic that has been used in our time.
Thank you. Madam.
Thank you for the microphone. There already is a definition of anti-Semitism. It is in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, ratified by the 31 countries that have signed to this definition. I am surprised you're not using it. I am surprised this definition seems to be twisted here. And I am a bit shocked at the conspiratorial nature of this debate. And I want to say, Mr. Galloway, Mr. Livingston, Mr. Greenstein, you do not speak on behalf of the Jewish community here.
Thank you. Who else would like to contribute? The gentleman at the back.
Yes, my name is Jashua. I think one thing, it really is almost needless to say, but there's an interdependency, I think, between Zionism and anti-Semitism, because if you didn't have one without the other, neither would exist, really. Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, undoubtedly he had to have been spurred by anti-Semitism, which is why he decided he was going to be the sort of his self-appointed crusader against, anti-Semitism. In much the same way that, Islamophobia feeds off militant Islamism and vice versa. But the fact of the matter is that when you have hatred always cuts through both sides. When you have one side criticizing the other side, when you have one side vilifying the other side, it's bad news for all. But what we've really got to recognise is that in the case of Israel, the wrong people, in my opinion, are being punished for the injustices meted out against Jewish people. It's the Palestinians who were almost completely blameless for that. And that is probably the biggest irony in all of that, despite the symbiotic relationship, that the Palestinians who were categorically not responsible for the Holocaust, and for the most part, there were Jews in Palestine that lived before side by side with, other Muslims, Arabs, Christians, but they are the totally innocent party, even though obviously there's a codependency between anti-Semitism and Zionism. Yeah.
Tony Greenstein, there are many ironies in this story, aren't there? The founders of Zionism were not religious people. They were almost to a man atheistic Jews. And yet this has now developed into a claim that Israel must be the Jewish state because God promised this land to the Jews. Another irony is that the leaders of the Zionist movement were negotiating seriously with the then very powerful British Empire to create a state of Israel in many other parts of the world. I mean, it's counterfactual history, but Patagonia could have become Israel. The Seychelles could have become Israel. Many other places, Uganda, were actually discussed seriously by the leaders of the Zionist movement with the British Empire as being a place where they could found a state called Israel.
It is, but to be fair, the Zionist movement, the Zionist Congress, although they passed narrowly the Uganda proposal in 1903, in essence rejected it. It caused massive splits in it. Herzl himself in the Jewish State, the founding pamphlet, spoke about Argentina or Palestine. So, but, what Zionism did was co-opt the religious symbols and the Bible to a colonizatory project. Zionism was never a religious formation. The people who opposed Zionism most at the beginning were the Orthodox Jews.
I know, yeah?
Yeah.
There's a very significant number of Jews in London. I know them. who are extremely Jewish.
That's right.
Extremely faithful to their religion, but extremely hostile to Israel.
Right. The first Zionist Congress was held in Basel in Switzerland. The reason why was because it was supposed to be held in Munich, and the Jewish community and the rabbis rose up in protest and said, why are you holding this anti-Semitic conference here? Because the Zionists said that Jews don't belong. To them, it was a form of Jewish anti-Semitism. But, I mean, let's be quite honest about it. You know, if you're going to defend, I mean, how do you defend arresting children at 3 a.m, blindfolding them, beating them up, taking them into custody in the West Bank? You can't. So it's far easier to attack someone who criticises that as anti-Semitic. That's where it comes from. When the lady, I think God said, well, we have a definition. Well, I mean, the definition is not 500 words. If you ask 99% of Jews in this country what the IHRA definition is, they would be stumped. Because as Stephen Sedley said, a former Jewish Court of Appeal judge, it's not a definition, it's indefinite. It's a very simple definition. When my dad was at Cable Street, he didn't need a definition of anti-Semitism to know what anti-Semitism was about. And that's what, it's a wholly false and bogus issue, this, about the definition of anti-Semitism.
Well, I should point out, for those watching internationally, because the lady implied that I was somehow breaking a law, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism has not been ratified by the number of countries she quoted. I think she said 37, I may be wrong. And it's certainly not been ratified by us. And it wouldn't stand up to a moment's examination in court, which is why it isn't in court.
It's a diplomatic agreement. I mean, I think 8 countries have ratified it. But it's been savaged by legal and academic scholars because it makes no sense.
Including the man who wrote it.
Including Kenneth Stern, who wrote it, who said it chills free speech. It's incoherent, contradictory. It says that you can't blame Jews for what happens in Israel, which I agree with. But it then says Israel is the culmination of Jewish self-determination. In other words, Israel is a Jewish state. Well, can you blame Scots for what happens in Scotland? Yes, you can. Can you blame Germans for what happens in Germany? Yes, you can. If Israel is a Jewish nation state, then it would be quite right to blame them for what Israel does. But of course, it's not a nation state of Jews, despite what it claims to be. The problem is, it's not a state of its own citizens either, and that's what makes it so wrong.
But many Labour members have been expelled and suspended and are under threat of either or both because of this IHRA 500-word indefinite definition. This was a clear example, was it not, of running from a controversy and then being hoist upon it.
Absolutely. I mean, the problem is Jeremy Corbyn should never have accepted the IHRA definition. It was if you like, something which has then been wielded against him. He should have said anti-Semitism is hostility to Jews and leave it at that. If someone is hostile or doesn't like Jews, then they shouldn't be in the party. But what their views are in Israel is completely irrelevant, has nothing whatsoever to do with it. But they've twisted opposition to Israel, opposition to apartheid with racism. I mean, did anyone ever accuse people who didn't like apartheid in South Africa of being hostile to white people? Of course not.
Right.
That's the logic
there can't be many people more hostile to the regime in Saudi Arabia than me. Am I being Islamophobic?
According to that logic, yes. Yes.
The gentleman in the middle.
Thank you, George. I mean, going on from the IHRA definition, which we've been talking about, something that really concerns me is that across the country now, because the issues are being conflated, you've got local authorities that are now adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism into their constitutions, into the way they work. And, you don't have the same for Islamophobia or, against any other group, an anti-black policy. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And by having it incorporated into government organisations as policy and it being adopted, they are conflating the two. And they are closing down, frankly, what could be and is a crucial debate about Palestine, about the occupation. And they're closing it down, as Peter's seen and lots of other people have seen, by just conflating it between the two. And I think it's absolutely abhorrent, and I think it's
Let me
a
ask
great
you
pity.
about that, because I didn't know that. What would that mean? That an employee of a local authority, or even an elected councillor
Well, this is what
in a
concerns
local
me.
authority, if they were to condemn Israel as a racist endeavour, which is the wording of the so-called definition, they could be what? Thrown out of their seat, sacked from their job?
Well, quite, yes. So it's not just
So it would
council
then have to go
employees.
to court.
Yeah, it would be elected representatives of the people. You know, if they said something which someone construed under the indefinite, definition as anti-Semitic, they could be put before their standards board and could be thrown out of office as a result.
Ken, that's a very disturbing development, isn't it? As I say, that would have to end up in the High Court, and this IHRA definition would have to then be challenged on the floor of the court.
Well, I'm certain it's going to end up in the court. The actual definition, I don't have a problem with. That's fine. But the examples that are then attached to it make it very difficult to be able to criticise the policies of the Israeli government. That's, I think, the big problem there. It's the examples they've attached to it mean if you're going to criticise the policies of the Israeli government, you can be accused of being anti-Semitic. Now, I criticise the policies of the British government all the time. No one says I'm anti-British, and I think this is a mistake. I mean, the simple, and also so much is just repeated in the media and not checked out.
No.
I mean, on the day that the General Secretary of the Labour Party suspended me back in 2016, he didn't pick up the phone to say, "Is it true you said Hitler was a Zionist?" But you'd had a Labour MP, John Mann, going on television saying I said Hitler was a Zionist. Now, how can anyone say a man who loathed Jews all his life was a Zionist? But this went round the world globally. And I think that's what's wrong with all of this. I mean, I'm not a millionaire. I can't afford to go off and sue all of this. I've just had to live with it. But I was really struck in the couple of weeks after I was suspended, somewhere between 30 or 40 Jewish people came up to me on the street and they say, "We know what you said is true. Don't give in." And a lot of them said, "What on earth is all this about?" I mean, the Jewish people know their history. They're an expert. I think the Jewish community in Britain is the best educated. I mean, more of them have a university degree than any other community. I think you actually look, it's only about 0.1% of the world's population is Jewish, but Jews have won something like 20% of the awards for science and
Nobel
culture
Prizes
and art,
and so on.
all of that.
Yeah, of course, no one doubts the level of achievement of Jewish
Jews
people.
will bring a
This is why
boost to your economy and to your culture
This is why
and to your science.
Coming from my political background, it's why I feel it's such a monstrosity to hear such a thing said about me. Because, frankly, many, maybe even most, but certainly many of my political and cultural heroes are Jewish. The idea that someone like me, someone like you, even more ridiculously, someone like Tony, can be an anti-Semite seems to me such an offence against all logic and language even, that how can anyone take it seriously?
There isn't a week goes by in which I don't spend some time socially with one of my Jewish friends. And if I was anti-Semitic, it's very odd that my Jewish girlfriends never seem to notice this and kick me out,
Well, we'll gloss over that point, Ken. The lady here.
Hi, Hina Malik. I sat on this program because I wasn't sure about this topic, and I think I've heard people who have got command on anti-Semitism. For me, and my understanding is, whether it is a narrative against Muslim as Islamophobia or anti-Semitic against Jews or anti-Hindus, I think is the narrative that states use or people use to achieve their political agendas. And that needs to stop. For me, it's simple. It's anti-Semitism against Jewish belief, not again. You can criticize Israeli on their policies. It should not be part of anti-Semitic. And I have a better understanding today. And I think any form of extremism against any community should be just completely disregarded, and it should not be tolerated.
Tony, can I ask you, you're the best person in this audience, at least, to answer this. What do you think? Because I'm struck by what Ken said about the number of Jewish people who come up to him and say the things that they have said to him. I'd be lying if I said they do to me. They don't. And the reason I'm wearing a hat is because of a very severe assault I suffered from a supporter of Israel who had recently converted to Judaism. But what's the real feeling, do you think, of Jewish people? We know that the very Orthodox Jews are very hostile to Israel. We know that left-wing Jewish people like you are equally hostile to Israel. That takes two quite big chunks out, secular opponents of Israel, religious opponents of Israel. There's a small Jewish population in Britain, something like 250,000. If you take these two segments out, what do you think the real feeling is of the people in the middle of that equation I've just drawn?
I think most Jews are ambivalent about the whole issue. But it's interesting that last year, 29 Orthodox rabbis wrote a joint letter saying that they opposed the Board of Deputies' attack on Jeremy Corbyn and that this wasn't in their name. No publicity, apart from Squawk Box, was given to that letter. It was in the Jewish Chronicle, where they tried to pour cold water on it and even say that it wasn't genuine. But there was no publicity at all. We have a narrative which has been run by the BBC and the other news organisations, which only carries one side of the story. So it's taken as read that Corbyn and the Labour Party are anti-Semitic. So many Jews will subscribe to it, not because they believe it. I mean, if you ask them, why is the Labour Party anti-Semitic? I doubt if 1% would be able to say. And if they did, they'd probably mention something about Israel, without understanding that historically Zionism and anti-Semitism have gone together like Siamese twins. When Herzl wrote in his diaries that the anti-Semites will be our friends and our allies, he wrote it for a purpose. It's true. They wanted Jews out. And the
isn't
Zionists
Mr.
wanted them out.
Netanyahu practicing that right now? Some of his best friends are anti-Semites.
That's right. I mean, what struck me when Donald Trump gave a State of the Union speech, he spent 17 minutes attacking refugees as the scum of the earth, as it were. And then he turned around and said how terrible this anti-Semitism was. You know, at the same time, at the Hanukkah commemoration around Christmas, he addressed a group of Jews and said, Israel is your country. Which, and if that's not anti-Semitic, I don't see what is. You know, so anti-Semitism and Zionism go hand in hand.
There's a famous actress in Britain, not that famous, Maureen Lipman. She has resigned from the Labour Party twice without having rejoined it. She announced that she was leaving it over anti-Semitism when Labour had a Jewish leader.
That's right, yes. Yeah.
And the reason was that Jewish leader had said that Labour, if in government, would recognise a Palestinian state.
Yeah, she's fiercely anti-Palestinian. It's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism. I mean, I like to quote Primo Levi, who was an Italian survivor of the Holocaust. He was Jewish, of course, when he said the Palestinians are the Jews of Israel. That is really what it's about. And today, you know, everything Israel does to Palestinians is an imitation of what was done to Jews in the period leading up to the Holocaust in Germany. The same barring of Palestinians from hundreds of Jewish communities in Israel. I mean, that is an apartheid situation. And they were the measures taken against the Jewish community, which was impoverished in Germany. The succession of legislative decrees that they couldn't live in certain places, they couldn't work in certain professions. All of that is unrolling in Israel today. Palestinians are a demonized minority. And that, you know, when Netanyahu comes out and says, this is not a state of all its citizens, I mean, this is exactly what the Nuremberg Law said.
Ken Livingston.
Guys, it's interesting. If you go back to when all this started, only after Jeremy became our leader, early in 2016, 80 Labour Party members who were Jewish did a joint letter that was published in The Guardian, and they said that in all their hundreds of years as Labour Party members, not one of them had ever heard or seen a single anti-Semitic thing. And yet this then dominated the news for the next 2 years. We need to see what where's the proof of this? I think the Labour Party machine has found something like 100 members out of 500,000 have tweeted something anti-Semitic, and they've been suspended, and that's right that should be. But that's about 1 in every 10,000 members or something. The idea...
Yes,
Labour
has roughly 600,000 members.
Yeah, and so literally this is a distraction, and my worry is that this obsession about it in the media is encouraging genuine anti-Semites to do anti-Semitic things. Now, they're not Labour Party members, but they'll go up and they'll assault a Jew on the streets or daub something on a synagogue. And that's, I think, the worst aspect of all of this. Not the damage it does to the Labour Party, but the insecurity it causes the Jewish community living in this country.
And what about in the United States? It's going to, if Sanders runs, either as the Democratic Party candidate or as an independent, both of which are possible, he's going to be attacked like Tony Greenstein is. You may be Jewish, but you're an anti-Semite.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I think the real fear about Bernie Sanders in America is the first person ever to be a possible presidential occupier of the White House who actually comes out and says, I'm a socialist. And that has terrified the establishment.
Terrifying. It's just frightened the horses here. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kali Mahorra on Al Mayadeen Television. Thanks for watching. Thank you all very much.